Hello, and welcome to the Center for Advanced Studies in Child Welfare Professional Training Module on the experiences of Somali and Oromo youth in Minnesota's child welfare system. This is the second module in a series of 2 modules about the experiences of refugee families in Minnesota's child welfare system. The first module provides information on characteristics and experiences of the different refugee communities in Minnesota that is important for effective social work practice with families from these communities. This second module provides an overview of a specific quantitative study we conducted on the characteristics of and experiences of Somali and Oromo youth involved in Minnesota's child protection system. We are grateful for the financial support of federal Title IV funding through the Minnesota Department of Human Services and the Center for Advanced Studies in Child Welfare. As Module 1 illustrated, limited research has been conducted on the experiences of refugee families involved with Child Protection Services, or CPS, in the U.S. The risk and protective factors that led to their involvement, the extent to which CPS services were responsive to their cultural and practical needs, or the outcomes of existing service interventions for these populations. One reason for this limited information is that data on refugee status is often unavailable in CPS data systems. For example, in Minnesota, Somalis and Oromo people from Ethiopia have been arriving in large numbers since the early 1990s and continue to make up a large proportion of refugee arrivals today. However, in Minnesota's CPS data system, these groups are coded racially as African American, and no mention is made of their refugee status. Somali and Oromo refugee families have language, religious, and cultural practices that differ from the majority of U.S.-born individuals of African descent. A greater understanding of the unique characteristics and experiences of refugee families involved with CPS is important for creating services and supports that best support the healthy functioning of these families. We conducted an exploratory quantitative study examining the rates of involvement and the factors that impact involvement of Somali and Oromo refugee families in Minnesota's CPS system. Our primary research questions were as follows. What proportion of Somali and Oromo children has a history of involvement with CPS? What are the experiences of Somali and Oromo children and families involved with CPS? And what strengths and needs of Somali and Oromo families were identified by workers using the Structured Decision-Making, or SDM, assessment? As previously mentioned, information on refugee status is not available via Minnesota's CPS reporting system, the Social Service Information System, or SSIS. However, here at the University of Minnesota, we house a unique data system referred to as the MN-LINK project. The MN-LINK project uses statewide administrative data from multiple state agencies to answer questions about the effects of policies, programs, and practice on the well-being of youth in Minnesota. For our study, we use secondary data from the Minnesota Department of Human Services and the Minnesota Department of Education, in accordance with data sharing agreements between MN-LINK and these state agencies. To identify our sample, we use the Home Primary Language Code located in the Minnesota Department of Education's Automated Reporting Student System and pulled out students whose home language was either Somali or Bantu, 2 languages spoken in Somalia, or Afrin Oromo, the language spoken by the Oromo of Ethiopia. A total of 19,968 Somali and Oromo youth were identified from the MDE data during the 2010-2011 academic year. These youth records were then matched with their corresponding Department of Human Services SSIS records to identify which youth had previous involvement in the child protection system in Minnesota between the years of 2000 and 2013. After probabilistic and hand matching, 629 and 62 Oromo youth were identified as CPS-involved youth, resulting in a final sample of 691 youth. Information gathered from the Minnesota Department of Education data included free reduced lunch status, which was used to reflect socioeconomic status of youth, the homeless and highly mobile status, limited English proficiency label, special education eligibility, the grade the youth was in during the academic year of 2010-2011, and gender. In the MDE dataset, male and female were the only options for gender. From the Department of Human Services dataset, we pulled out child protection system indicators, including whether or not they had been the alleged victim in at least one accepted child maltreatment case during the study time period, as well as the total number of accepted reports for each youth. We noted what type of CPS response the case received: family assessment, also known as differential response, or family investigation, which is used for cases with alleged substantial child maltreatment. Whether or not the alleged maltreatment was determined to have occurred, the type of allegation, including neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse, mental injury and emotional harm, and medical neglect, whether or not they were court-ordered into a placement setting paid for by the county outside of their homes as a result of a child protection case, the type of out-of-home placement, including pre-adoptive home relative, pre-adoptive home non-relative, foster family home relative, foster family home non-relative, group home, residential treatment center, supervised independent living, or juvenile correctional facility. Finally, we examined the strengths and needs identified by caseworkers as part of the Structured Decision-Making Strengths and Needs Assessment, required by law to be completed by caseworkers within a 45-day investigation period prior to the development of an initial service plan. We then conducted our data analysis using IBM's SPSS statistical package. We calculated descriptive statistics, chi-squares, and t-tests. Our first research question was what proportion of Somali and Oromo children have a history of involvement with CPS. Our results showed that a relatively small proportion of Somali and Oromo youth had CPS involvement during the study time period. Only 3.4% Somali and 3.9% of the Oromo. Of those who were involved in CPS, 86% received free or reduced price lunch, 57.9% were labeled with limited English proficiency, and 20.8% received special education services. Only 4% of youth involved in CPS qualified as homeless or highly mobile. Our next question was what are the experiences of Somali and Oromo children and families involved with CPS? The majority of cases received a family assessment response, and of those who received family investigation, the majority resulted in a finding of maltreatment. Although a higher percentage of Oromo youth received family assessment and had substantiated maltreatment findings than the Somali youth, these differences were not statistically significant. This table illustrates the alleged types of maltreatment. The most common allegations were neglect, followed by physical abuse. Although percentages differed between Somali and Oromo youth, again, these differences were not statistically significant. Overall, 1,187 unique allegations of child maltreatment were recorded for our sample of 691 youth. Approximately 17% of the sample, or 117 youth, experienced at least one episode of out-of-home placement. Rates of out-of-home placement were higher for Somali youth than Oromo youth, but again, this was not statistically significant. This table presents information about the mean number of out-of-home placement episodes, the mean number of days in out-of-home placement, and the mean number of placement settings. Only 8 Oromo youth in our sample experienced out-of-home placement, and thus statistical comparisons could not be conducted on this data. This table illustrates the types of out-of-home placement settings experienced by youth in our sample. Of significant note is the high use of restrictive settings, including group homes, residential treatment facilities, and juvenile correction facilities. Over half of the settings experienced by Somali and Oromo youth were restrictive in nature. 45% of Somali youth and 62% of Oromo youth had experienced one or more placements in a restrictive setting. Residential treatment facilities were the most common placement settings for Somali youth, with 30% having experienced one or more placements in a residential treatment facility. These placement settings made up 41% of all placement settings for Somali youth. Our third research question was what strengths and needs of Somali and Oromo families were identified by workers using the SDM assessment. In terms of strengths identified by caseworkers, both Somali and Oromo families were identified as having a healthy understanding of and/or not abusing alcohol or drugs. Both groups were also identified as being without health issues that affect family functioning. Although the majority of families were assessed as having adequate social support, mental health, and parenting skills, these areas were also seen as needs for a sizable minority. 1 in 4 Somali families and 1 in 5 Oromo were assessed as lacking sufficient social support. 1/3 of both groups were rated as having needs in regards to mental health, coping skills, and parenting. The majority of both groups were identified as having sufficient resources and supportive relationships. Oromo parents were statistically significantly more likely to be identified as having insufficient or poorly managed resources than Somali parents, while Somali parents were statistically significantly more likely to be identified as having supportive household relationships than Oromo parents. Our study is the first to our knowledge to assess rates of Somali and Oromo youth involvement in CPS. Compared to annual, that is 1 year point in time, CPS involvement rates for other racial and ethnic minority groups, the longitudinal rates for Somali and Oromo youth in our study were low. Annual rates of CPS involvement for African Americans in Minnesota during the study time period were 5%, and for American Indians they were 8%. Only one racial minority group, Asians, experienced a lower CPS rate of 1%. The low rates of CPS involvement among Somali and Oromo youth are interesting to note, given that African Americans, the group that Somalis and Oromo are grouped into within the broader CPS data system, have been identified as disproportionately overrepresented in Minnesota's child protection system, compared to the general population. Also, refugee families are involved with health, social, and resettlement services, which results in frequent contact with mandated reporters. One reason for the low CPS involvement rates among Somali and Oromo youth may be due to the strong social support systems they have. The majority of Somali and Oromo caregivers in this study were identified by caseworkers as having adequate or strong social support systems, indicating that these communities have been able to rebuild their social networks and support systems in the context of resettlement in Minnesota. However, another reason for low CPS involvement could be due to underreporting of child maltreatment by members of refugee communities due to distrust of government agencies. Somali and Oromo families have well-founded fears of government agencies, given their histories of persecution in their countries of origin. In addition, in Minnesota, mistrust and suspicion of government agencies in the Somali community has heightened due to intense scrutiny and surveillance by the FBI following a couple of high-profile cases involving several young Somalis aiding terrorist groups in Somalia. Social workers may also fear reporting refugee families to CPS for fear of a threat to their immigration status. The types of maltreatment allegations among the two groups in the study were slightly different than what is found in the general population. Oromo youth had higher rates of physical abuse allegations. Both Somali and Oromo had lower rates of sexual abuse allegations. Family investigation responses were more common among the sample in this study, but the rate of out-of-home placement was similar to the general population. One of the most interesting and concerning findings in our study was the high use of restrictive out-of-home placements. More than half of all placements for Somali and Oromo youth as a group were in restrictive placements. In 2012, only 20% of the general population was placed in residential treatment, and that number includes youth who were in residential settings but not placed there by CPS. The study did not explore the reasons for this high rate of restrictive placement, but one possible reason could be related to rates of mental health needs among this population. CPS workers identified significant mental health needs among Somali and Oromo youth and their caregivers, particularly for Somalis. Placements in residential treatment facilities require a mental health diagnosis, which suggests that there may be significant mental health needs in the Somali community that either cannot or are not being met in an outpatient setting. It is also notable that very few Somali or Oromo youth were placed in relative foster care. This finding is consistent with previous research, which found that immigrant youth were less likely to be placed with relatives. This finding is concerning because relative or kinship placements have consistently been shown to lead to favorable outcomes with respect to behavioral and educational outcomes. In addition, for refugee groups, non-relative placement is especially concerning when foster parents do not share a common language with the children or youth in their care and/or are unfamiliar with and unprepared to provide for their cultural needs. Factors that have been identified as contributing to a lack of licensed foster care providers in immigrant communities include family separation, unfamiliarity with licensing requirements or procedures, and families living in multi-generation housing structures that do not meet licensing standards. Finally, it is important to note that when CPS workers assessed family strengths and needs, the majority of families were identified as having adequate or strong social support and adequate resources. This suggests that refugee communities, after initial help in resettling, are able to obtain adequate economic resources and social supports. However, some families continue to struggle long after resettlement, and it is the experiences of these vulnerable families that we need to better understand. Our study had several limitations that need to be noted when considering our findings. First, we formed our sample by using the home primary language category in the data from the Minnesota Department of Education. This is not the most accurate way to identify refugee families, and it is possible that our sample is somewhat biased. Secondly, the sample size for our Oromo youth was small, which limited our ability to conduct statistical analyses comparing Somali and Oromo youth in out-of-home placement. Third, our study did not include a comparison group of non-CPS involved Somali or Oromo youth, other refugee youth, or youth with non-refugee status. And finally, the strengths and needs assessment used in this study relied on information that was collected during a worker's initial visit with the family, when rapport was in its early stages of development. CPS workers' assessments are based on information that a family initially chooses to share or that could be gleaned from other sources. Refugee families may be hesitant to willingly share information with government representatives because of concern about how they will be treated and what the consequences might be. Thus, they may not report some challenges they are facing because they do not know how the information will be used or how CPS could help them. The accuracy of these assessments may also be impeded by the degree to which the forms and processes apply Western views and parenting norms. More research is clearly needed to understand how mental health needs are being identified in CPS and how accurately the structured decision-making measure assesses the strengths and needs of families with refugee backgrounds. Additionally, qualitative studies are needed to better understand the experiences of refugee families involved in CPS. The high use of placements in restrictive settings for Somali and Oromo families involved in CPS is alarming and may suggest that the CPS system is ill-equipped to respond to the mental health and cultural needs of refugee families. More research is needed to determine why the utilization of restrictive placements for Somali and Oromo youth is so high, and what steps can be taken to find more appropriate but less restrictive settings for these youth. However, despite the need for more research in these areas, the study does suggest some steps that practitioners and agencies can take today to help improve the experiences and outcomes for refugee families involved with CPS. Officially, the Immigrant and Nationality Act recognizes the need to prepare local systems for serving new refugee populations before their arrival and charges refugee resettlement agencies to work closely with local stakeholders toward this goal. Cross-system collaborative models between refugee resettlement and community-based organizations and CPS have shown some promise for effectively serving the needs of families with refugee backgrounds. However, a lack of official guidance and inadequate funding inhibit resettlement agencies from broad consultation with local systems, and significant training needs for CPS workers remain. Steps should be taken to increase and adequately fund collaboration between refugee resettlement agencies, refugee community groups, and CPS to provide needed training and consultation to improve service to these families. Trainings could include topics such as understanding cultural backgrounds and parenting practices of diverse populations, services and supports for refugees, effects of migration and acculturation on family systems, mental health and trauma needs, making successful mental health referrals, working with interpreters, and understanding the discrimination experiences of refugees. Evidence suggests that some refugee families may be referred to CPS for problems related to low incomes, inability to access social service systems, and acculturative stress, rather than abuse. For CPS workers to adequately identify and respond to these needs, they must assess families' economic and social resources, levels of acculturation, migration histories, and strengths, in addition to assessing child maltreatment. Lastly, CPS workers should provide concrete assistance, cultural orientation, and incorporate goals related to acculturation as part of their service provision. Thank you for listening to our module. We hope it has been informative. For future information, this reference list provides a number of important studies in the areas of refugee resettlement, mental health, and resettlement stressors.